Hi. In this lecture, we're going to look at what was going on during the colonial period as far as schooling was concerned. And by colonial period, we're talking about predominantly British colonies in North America, but we might also touch on a few other things. In this lecture, we're going to talk about education during the colonial period up until the time of the Revolution, at least the Revolutionary period. When we think about education, we tend to think about the British in North America during the colonial period. And certainly that was very important, but there were also other things going on as well. But let's look at some of these highlights if we can. So, Harvard College, the first university, the first college, was established in 1636, which is very early in the colonial period. There were actually other schools, but let's look at Harvard College as the first one that was established and sustained itself. Then you have in the 1640s, Massachusetts passes the first school law. In 1647, the Old Deluder Satan Act. We're going to talk about some of these later on. The New England Primer in 1690. 1693, you have other universities like the College of William and Mary, Yale, the College of New Jersey, which is eventually going to become Princeton, and other types of schools founded. And then you also have Franklin's Academy. And this is by Benjamin Franklin. So there's a difference coming in. You've read a book about Franklin, so this is a different type of school. And then finally, you have the first book on pedagogy. This is for teachers on school management in 1771. Now, again, we normally focus on the British period. Let's also look at what was going on in other colonies in North America. Most of this was Catholic schooling led by the church and missionaries. And so you get some even earlier than you do in the British colonies because the Spanish were here nearly 100 years, the 1490s, early 1500s. So by this time, we're talking about the 1600s, and they've got a school set up in San Augustine, Florida. Now, the school here, the school in New Mexico, and along the California coast, most of these are going to be mission schools. They're schools set up to convert Native American children and Native American adults into Spanish subjects, Spanish citizens, which means they need to be Catholic and they need to understand the language and how to read and write. And so this is going to be blended together with church activities. Likewise, the French, very similar because they're Catholic as well, along the St. Lawrence River Valley into Montreal and into the Great Lakes region a little further west. They're establishing some schools. In 1606, we look at the first Virginia Charter. This is the document that establishes Virginia as a colony, and it's important to read over this, and I'll give you just a second to do that. As you can see by reading this, this is largely to help convert others. So this is the Virginia Charter. These aren't Catholics. These are Protestants. And they too have the idea that their job, or part of their job anyway, is to help convert people and to make them humans, to make them civil, and make them accept the European form of government, the British form of government. Here's another document from the Virginia colony. Notice this, that they want to encourage people to take Native American children and to make them gentle, teach them our English tongue and the principles of religion. Instead of iron and steel, you must have patience and humanity to manage their crooked nature to your form of civility. This is very paternalistic. It's also very dismissive of Native American culture and traditions. In the Virginia colony, they did try to establish a college. And again, this college was to train Native Americans to become English, to teach them Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and to teach them some reading and writing and to make English subjects out of them. So Similar, in fact, to what the Catholics were doing, but a little bit different. In 1617, everybody's heard the story of Pocahontas. That's the Walt Disney version of Pocahontas. In real life, Pocahontas, who was married to John Rolfe, not John Smith, but John Rolfe. So Rebecca Rolfe was her name, the name that she took, the English name she took. She passed away. 1618, the Virginia colony tried to establish this Henrico College in order to train Native Americans. Likewise, for the children who lived in the colonies, there was a school brought out by the colonizing agents, the East India Company. All efforts came to a grinding halt on Good Friday, March 22nd of 1622, when Native Americans in the Chesapeake Bay area rose up against the British settlers or invaders, as they were called. There were simply too many of them, the Native Americans felt, and so they wanted to uh, get rid of these people who were encroaching upon their land, and they did so by massacring as many as they could. And now the blood was on both sides, but this was a big setback for the English colonies. In the British colonies, you do see different types of schools that emerge once things began to settle down after the uh, Good Friday massacre. Now, there's still other problems with Native Americans to be sure, but education continues to be seen as very important. There were schools, many of them named after who taught them or where they were located. Parson schools, these were largely taught by religious ministers. There were charity schools. There was, even at this early time, an idea that you had to educate the poor children, even if it's only for work, right? You want to educate them enough so that they can get a job. But there was also the Society for the Propagation of Gospel in Foreign Lands. This is a missionary organization that took it upon themselves to provide schooling in missionary. Well, you think, well, that's far away, but what they were doing was looking at, well, first of all, this is a British organization. So they were looking at spreading the gospel in the New World. You had old field schools. These were schools that were in fields that were not being used to grow crops. They were letting them rotate out of the planting rotation. So while these fields were dormant, while they were just growing grass and not crops, you could put schools in there. There were also apprenticeships. Is that education? Certainly it was. And not only were apprentices learning how to do jobs, they were learning how to read and how to write. And in many of these contracts, as your book points out, sometimes when a parent apprenticed their child, or if the child was a ward of the state and it was apprenticed, there were in these apprenticeship contracts requirements that the master educate these children. Latin schools were another type of schools. The Latin schools were basically to teach children Latin grammar. This was going to be very necessary if you sought post-secondary schooling or secondary schooling. If you were going to go on in your education, you needed to know Latin and Latin grammar because there were a lot of stories, a lot of writing still done in Latin. There were also dame schools. These were schools usually by wealthy women who taught children. And sometimes they were what we might call a finishing school, schools for young women to learn how to behave in proper society. Here's an interesting quote that your book brings up. This is a series of questions that were sent to the governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkley. And he responded to these in 1671. It was just a list of questions and his responses to these questions. One of the questions they put at him was, what course is taken about the instructing of people? What about the religious, what other provisions to the paying of your ministry? And how Sir William Berkeley replied is very telling. The same course that is taken in England out of towns, every man according to his ability, instructing his children. So it was up to the parent to instruct the children. It was up to the family to be the teacher. But I thank God that there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have those years, for learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sex into the world, and printing has divulged them, and libels against the best government. God keep us from both. So that was the Virginia colonies. Let's move a little further north to the Puritan colonies near Boston, where the Pilgrims were coming in, the Puritans were coming in. Now, they landed Massachusetts Bay later, after the people in the Chesapeake region in Virginia have already been established for some 20 years or better. One of the interesting events, or one of the interesting topics that comes out of this, is the development of books. Now, first you have horn books. These were books that were made out of the horns of animals, cut very thinly, shaved, and so you could write on them and then erase them. But the predominant book of the period was a school book known as the New England Primer. And lots has been written about this. There's pictures of the primer in your textbook. And this is the one that goes to the alphabets, and it's very religiously based. Still, education is largely in the domain of the parents. And this idea that the Puritans had of Boston being a city on a hill, a beacon to light the way to truth and revelation, wasn't doing so well. By 1647, you have the Old Deluder Satan Act. This is in your primary sources, so you can read it. But within 20 years, they have the Halfway Covenant. And this was a proof that the Puritan way was kind of dying out. This idea that in order to be saved, you had to have a religious conversion. And not everybody had one. So were these people really saved? Were they church members? And in order to preserve the government, this halfway covenant kind of took some of those religious requirements out of participation in the government. And while we're on the topic of religion, one event that did occur, this was, I say an event, but it went on for several decades, was the First Great Awakening. Started in the 1730s in the Northeast, up around New York and that area. And it was a series of religious revivals. One of the most famous ministers was a man named Jonathan Edwards, who talked about humans being sinners in the hands of an angry God. God is mad at us. And so, therefore, our destiny is eternal damnation. Now, these religious revivals resulted in seminaries, church schools, church colleges for the training of ministers popping up in various denominations across the colonies. And I have some listed here. The College of New Jersey in 1746, Dartmouth in 1763, the college in the English colony of Rhode Island, which is later on going to be Brown University, 1764, and then Queen's College, which is today Rutgers, in 1766. So as these different types of Protestant denominations were cropping up, largely this is due to the First Great Awakening, but it's also due, if you want to trace it back further, to the Protestant Reformation. And as these new denominations are coming in, they want to establish ways of training those ministers. In the middle colonies, now this is like New York, Pennsylvania, kind of those colonies between New England on one hand and Virginia on the other. So you have a lot more diversity as far as religion is concerned. People are coming from different backgrounds, different commitments to their faiths. And so there is just a lot of diversity. And in this mix, you have a young printer named Benjamin Franklin. Now, Franklin was very interested in education. He was one of the founders of the American Philosophical Society, and he had also been involved with several education communities in other parts of the Northeast, so New York and Virginia. And he's also instrumental in the creation of organizations to promote education. And here are a couple of those. And of course, I close out with this remarks that he wrote on the savages of North America that I hope you're reading. Colonial education was to preserve the local faith, the dominant faith of whatever group established these educational schools, universities, colleges. Education was also a means of converting Native Americans, making them more receptive to colonial rule and behavior and society. And also, the religious revivals of the 1730s led to an expanse in education. Well, thank you very much, and we'll move on to the next chapter by looking at education in the Revolutionary period and what education meant to democracy.